trucking is slowly dying, and the reason why is so controversial that it might get me blacklisted from the industry. The truth is, brokers have been quietly destroying the trucking industry for years, and I have all the proof right here. If you haven't heard the news already, small carriers are going bankrupt at record rates, while brokers are making more money than ever before. And the worst part is, they've actually rigged the entire system so carriers can't do anything about this. I know that sounds like a conspiracy, but that's why in this video, I'm going to expose how brokers are stealing billions from carriers every single year, forcing them to sign away their rights, and blacklisting anyone who tries to stand up to them. Now, before I jump into that, a quick word from the sponsor of today's video, Dispatcher University. After years of you guys asking, I finally launched one of the cheapest truck dispatching school communities in the world. For just $97 per month, you can get access to the full 5-week training program where I'll show you step-by-step how I dispatch trucks and find carriers. And the best part is, if you join today, you can actually test everything out for free for 7 days. Again, to join for free, just go to guild22.com/dispatch or just click the first link in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video. Anyways, as I was saying, in order for me to explain what's actually going on, you need to understand how we got here in the first place. This broker problem that I'm talking about actually started all the way back in the 1930s. Back then, the industry was really wild. There was zero regulation, zero stability, just total chaos. It got so bad that the government had to step in with the Motor Carrier Act of 1935 just to keep the trucking industry from falling apart. Now, even with all that chaos going on, trucking itself was actually super simple back then. When shippers needed to move freight, they just called carriers directly. That's it. There were no middlemen, no load boards, definitely no brokers just taking a cut of your money. They were just straightforward relationships built on trust and getting the job done. Now, this worked perfectly for almost 50 years until 1980 came along and flipped everything upside down. Overnight, the government dropped this brand new law called the Motor Carrier Act of 1980 that completely deregulated trucking. This law basically made it possible for anyone to start a trucking company. And if you know anything about supply and demand, you know this isn't going to end well for truckers. These old relationships that people had built up between shippers and carriers, they started falling apart, okay? There was just too many new players, too much chaos. And that's when things started to get really ugly. This explosion of new trucking companies in the industry created a huge mess. Shippers were drowning, trying to find enough trucks to move their freight. Carriers were bleeding money, driving empty, just trying to find their next load. And in this chaos is when the brokers came in and made their move. Brokers started showing up with what seemed like the perfect solution. They said something like, "Don't worry about anything, we'll find carriers for shippers and loads for truckers." Simple as that. Now, I can't lie, this actually worked pretty well at first, Brokers took a small cut, like 5 or 10% for making those connections happen. Which, fair enough, they were fixing a real problem. But this changed very, very quickly when the internet came along. Brokers suddenly realized that they had something incredibly powerful. They controlled every relationship with shippers, every piece of load information, and most importantly, they controlled every dollar that carriers could make. Once they figured this out, that small cut wasn't so small anymore. These days, brokers aren't taking 5 or 10%. They're grabbing 25 to 30% of every single load, sometimes even more. And just so you understand how crazy this is, let me break it down into real money. Okay, so on a $4,000 load, they're pocketing over $1,000 just for making a few phone calls. Meanwhile, truckers are out there burning fuel, fixing their truck, living on the road, taking all the real risks. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, okay? If brokers are making so much money for doing so little, why don't truckers do it? Trust me, a lot of carriers have tried, but here's the problem. Brokers have had years to convince shippers that working directly with carriers is too complicated. They've built up this whole story about carrier reliability that still runs in the industry today. Now look, shippers do have legitimate concerns. They worry about service reliability, insurance coverage, and what happens if a small carrier goes out of business mid-contract. It all makes sense on paper. But here's what shippers don't realize. Brokers are actually creating more risk not less. When brokers are controlling all the relationships, they can hide the carrier performance data, manipulate rates, and even force good carriers out of the market if they don't play by the broker's rules. Then there's the big dogs like C.H. Robinson and TQL who take things to a whole nother level. These massive brokerages have locked shippers into these crazy contracts that force them to run all their freight through these brokers. We're talking about billions of dollars in freight every single year that carriers can't even touch directly. And this is exactly why today, if you're not running a massive fleet with dozens of trucks, 90% of shippers won't even give you the time of day. They'll just tell you to talk to their broker, which is exactly what the brokers want. And honestly, if you think that's bad, wait until you see the system that brokers have built to keep carriers trapped, because they've created this insane maze of requirements that new carriers have to navigate just to book a single load. I'm not even exaggerating when I say this. They've made it nearly impossible for new carriers to succeed. For example, to book a load right now, brokers want you to have 2 years of operating history, $750,000 in liability insurance, $100,000 in cargo insurance, and a perfect CSA score. For new carriers, that's like trying to get a job that requires experience, but you can't get experience without getting the job first. And here's the real killer. Just to meet those insurance requirements, small carriers are paying $8,000 to $12,000 every single year. And that's before they even move their first load. But check this out. Even if you jump through all their hoops, and meet every single requirement, brokers have got another way to screw you over. Here's something that I know all of you have experience with in this industry. You show up on time for your pickup, ready to go. The shipper takes 6 hours to load you, something that happens all the time. Because of this delay, you miss your delivery window. Now, guess who gets blamed? Not the shipper, who wasted 6 hours of your time, not the broker, who knew that the shipper always runs behind. You do. And here's the real sad part that most truckers don't realize. Every single hour you sit at the shipper, it's going to cost you almost $73 in lost revenue, okay? That's almost $440 you're losing just because the shipper couldn't get their act right. And while you're sitting there losing hundreds of dollars, guess what the brokers are doing? They're making more money than ever before. 10 years ago, they were taking 13% of each load. Today, they're grabbing over 18%. And those are just the averages. I've talked to so many brokers who say that they pocket more than 25% of every single load. Now, I know all this sounds bad and I'm not trying to depress you, but there is something else you need to know about, okay? Something that brokers have been desperately trying to keep hidden from carriers. For over 40 years, there's actually been a little known federal law on the books that could give carriers the upper hand against brokers. A law that could force brokers to finally show you exactly how much money they're really making off of your truck. The law that I'm talking about is called Regulation 371.3, and under this law, brokers are legally required to show you 3 things: the exact rate that they're charging the shipper, all their fees and deductions, and proof of what the shipper actually paid. And they can't just tell you, they have to show you the actual documents. Now, you're probably wondering, if this law exists, why are brokers still getting away with hiding their rates? Well, that's because brokers have found a really sneaky way to get around it. When you go to sign your rate confirmation for every single load that you book, brokers bury this tiny little clause in there that most carriers don't even notice. It usually says something like, carriers waive their right to access load payment information under 49 CFR 371.3. Now, just think about how messed up this is, okay? Brokers are literally forcing carriers to sign away their federal rights just to get loads. And if you refuse to sign that rate confirmation, obviously you don't get the load. If you ask them to remove that clause, you don't get the load. If you demand to see what the shipper is actually paying, you guessed it, you don't get the load. And it gets even worse because the few carriers who actually know about this law and try to enforce their rights, they get marked as difficult to work with on Carrier 411. And once this happens, other brokers stop answering their calls too. Just like that, you're basically blacklisted from the industry for trying to exercise your legal rights. But I have some good news for you. For the first time in 40 years, we might actually have a chance to stop this. Okay, the FMCSA just released new rules that are supposed to give truckers everything that they've been fighting for. And while these changes sound amazing on paper, there's still one massive problem that could ruin everything. So before I jump into that, let me just break down what these FMCSA's new rules would force brokers to do. Okay, so there's three major things. First and foremost, every single broker would have to switch to electronic records. That means no more losing your paperwork, okay? No more mysteriously missing documents. Everything gets stored digitally where it can be accessed. The second thing is, brokers would have exactly 48 hours to show you the complete details of any load you've hauled. I'm not just talking about the rate that they paid you, I'm talking about what the shipper actually paid them, all their fees, every single deduction that they took from your money. And third, they'd have to give you access to an electronic system where you can see all this information yourself without having to go through the broker. Now, all of this sounds great, but as I mentioned before, there's still a massive loophole in these new rules. Unfortunately, with these new rules, the FMCSA hasn't banned those waiver clauses that I told you about earlier. Brokers can still force you to sign away your rights to see this information. But right now, we still have a small window of opportunity to change this. The FMCSA is actually asking for public feedback on these new rules. Okay, so they specifically want to hear about these waiver clauses and how brokers use them against carriers. Now, just a heads up, you only have until January 21st, 2025 to make your voice heard. And let me just tell you, the big brokers are already flooding them with comments about why nothing should change, okay? Their lobbyists are working overtime, spending millions of dollars to keep the system exactly how it is. So, if you want these rules to actually protect truckers, here's what you need to do. Go to the FMCSA website or click the link in the description, I'll leave it in there, and the process is pretty simple. Just hit that document comments button at the top right hand side and tell them your story. Share real life examples that you've gone through. Tell them about the times you've been forced to waive your rights. Tell them about the loads that you've lost for asking questions. Tell them about all the penalties that you've had to pay for problems you didn't cause. You don't need any fancy legal language. You don't need a perfect story. You just need to be real. Because right now, brokers are counting on truckers to stay quiet. They're betting that you won't speak up and that you'll just accept the system that they keep building. But if enough truckers share their experiences, if enough carriers demand change, we might finally have a shot at fixing this broken system. Anyways, that's all I really have for you guys today. If you're interested in this topic and want to see how brokers are using Carrier 411 as a weapon against truckers, then you need to watch this video right here. So, with that being said, let me know what you guys think about all this in the comments below. Make sure you join my free school community, and I'll see you in the next video.